Mr. Speaker, when the world is in trouble, when peoples throughout history are in need of help because of oppression and they need freedom and liberty, those nations always call 911. And who answers on the other end of that call? Throughout history of this great nation, America answers. We always answer the call when somebody is in trouble and they need help. And such an occurrence occurred in 1950. In 1950, World War II was over with. The United States had downsized its military. Basically, we were unprepared for another war. But you know, war picks its own opportunities. And what occurred in 1950 was that in the Korean Peninsula, North Korea, with the aid of the Chinese, invaded our ally, South Korea. They went into the heartland of South Korea, and of course, South Korea called 911. America answered. They called it a UN operation, but history shows that UN operations basically are American operations, where Americans go and fight those battles. Our country also called it a conflict. Our own president at that time referred to it as a police action, but it was neither of those. It was a war. It was a war where Americans went and fought. I want to tell you about one such action that occurred in the Korean War, Mr. Speaker. You may or may not have ever heard of Hill 303 in South Korea. The Americans, under the control and operation of the 2nd Battalion, 5th Cavalry Regiment of the 1st Cavalry Division, had the high ground on Hill 303. Approaching them were a superior number of North Korean communists coming to take that hill. The Americans were pushed off that hill except for a small group of Americans who refused to leave. Company G, a mortar company, and Company H stayed on the hill, approaching troops that first they thought that these approaching troops were South Koreans coming to help them, but it turned out, of course, they were North Koreans. But they held their ground anyway, and they were overrun by the North Koreans. And here's what happened after the Americans retook the hill. As they retook the hill, they found out that those members of Mortar Company G and Company H, those that had been captured, had their hands tied behind their backs, that they were put in a gully there in South Korea, unknown to anybody, and they were machine gunned down. 40 of the 45 were murdered. The other 5 were able to survive, and some escaped. And this weekend, this nation honored our war dead for all wars. And I want to thank a school in my district, Creekwood Middle School, for honoring and remembering those 40 Americans that were murdered on Hill 303 in 1950 when the Americans held that ground and were overrun by the North Koreans. Creekwood Middle School has a history of honoring American history, especially in our wars. They did a history project not too many years ago on World War I. But at this project that they had on Saturday of last weekend, they honored these men as they should have that were murdered on Hill 303. They have a memorial there at Creekwood Middle School for them, probably the only memorial in the United States that honors those men at Hill 303 in Korea. There is one in South Korea, however. One of the people that was present then and also present Monday at Memorial Day at the Houston National Cemetery was Donald Foisey. Donald Foisey of Atascocita, Texas, is 80 years old. He got the Purple Heart that day because he was able to survive that onslaught of the North Koreans. At this time, Mr. Speaker, I'd ask unanimous consent to introduce the names of the 40 members of the Army that were murdered that day by the North Korean communists.
Without objection.
37,000 Americans died in Korea. When the war was over, it just ended. There was no peace treaty. It just stopped. It's a ceasefire. We still have Americans at the 38th parallel guarding that border. When those troops came home, they were ignored. Unlike Vietnam, those troops were abused. Those troops that came home from Korea were just basically ignored. America was more interested in Marilyn Monroe marrying the great baseball player Joe DiMaggio, and this new rock star Elvis Presley than they were honoring our war dead. It's important that America must always honor those that served and did not return, and those that served and returned, those that served and returned with the wounds of war. For Mr. Speaker, the worst casualty of war is to be forgotten, and that's just